Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with, well, one of the most persistent and frankly frustrating paradoxes in modern technology. We rely utterly on cryptography, right? These systems built on mathematical bedrock, large prime numbers, complex algorithms, concepts designed to be, well, literally unbreakable. Yet time and again, these systems fail, spectacularly, sometimes,
Yeah.
in the real world. Why?
That's exactly the question. Our mission today is to really dissect the fundamental importance of cryptographic protocols. And by doing that, expose this huge chasm between the theoretical strength of cryptography and how weak systems can be in the real world.
Yeah.
We're moving past let's say, the beauty of the pure mathematics and focusing really intensely on the protocol.
The protocol, meaning the
Yeah.
rules, the steps.
Exactly. The rules, the multi-step dances, the implementation procedures, even the human decisions that dictate how that math actually gets deployed.
Yeah, we dove into a pretty significant stack of sources for this one, and they really reveal this uncomfortable truth. Security isn't just about how hard the math problem is, it's about how messy the implementation gets. And we found that the failure point, it's almost always located in some subtle protocol design flaw, or maybe a weak implementation of a strong algorithm, or, and this is critical, the human tendency to just over-engineer systems.
Right, until they become complex, unmanageable, and, well, ultimately vulnerable.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Yeah.
They couldn't. We'll look at some real-world compromises that resulted from seemingly tiny errors. And the core paradox is this. We rely on increasingly complex code, increasingly complex protocols that honestly very few people truly understand. And that reliance, that's the source of the fragility.
So our goal for you, the listener, isn't to turn you into a cryptographer overnight. That's not feasible.
Yeah.
But it is to make you a highly informed observer. By the end of this deep dive, you should really understand the critical difference between a strong cipher, something like AES, and a strong implementation.
That's the key distinction.
Yeah. And you'll be ready, hopefully, to spot those specific red flags in complex systems, or maybe systems that haven't been properly vetted, because you'll know that mathematical perfection, well, it offers zero protection from imperfection in the code or the process around it.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's start with the sheer scale of the problem. Our source material, quite bluntly, calls it the sorry state of software. Modern systems are just incredibly complicated, and that complexity itself, that's where the fatal vulnerabilities creep in.
Yeah, this is really the starting line for any serious security discussion today. We're dealing with massive systems, often, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, sometimes millions. And when a system gets that big, two things happen. First, trying to comprehensively audit it, it becomes practically impossible. Who can truly understand every line?
Nobody, probably.
Right. And second, the vulnerability might not even be where you expect it, where you're looking.
You mean the fatal bugs might be completely separate from the actual security features?
Absolutely. A single line of code that handles something seemingly benign, maybe logging or error handling, something simple it can, under just the right or wrong circumstances, compromise the entire security posture of the system. The sources say fatal bugs may even be far removed from the security portion of the software. We kind of implicitly assume, oh, the encryption works, so the data's safe. But that's rarely the whole picture in a system of this scale.
And here's where it gets really interesting and quite subtle. It's often not one big, obvious blunder, but the interaction between features. Our sources really highlight this. Security problems are frequently created not by a single bug, but when, say, two or three features that look totally benign in isolation.
Yeah, perfectly safe on their own.
Exactly. But when they're taken together, can create a security breach. It's like this hidden combination lock that no single developer working on their piece ever foresaw.
That interaction effect is, I think, the heart of protocol fragility. Cryptographic protocols are, by their very definition, these complex, multi-step dances designed to achieve a specific goal.
Like establishing a secure key.
Right, or certifying a message, proving identity, doing all that without ever revealing the underlying secret itself.
Okay, let's unpack the complexity of that dance a bit. Consider the classic example, right?
Yeah.
Certified message delivery. You've got Alice, Bob, and Trent. Trent is the trusted third party, the TTP. And this is basically a 5-step protocol just to prove who sent what. Sounds simple, but...
It sounds simple on paper, yeah, but the reliance on Trent, on that trusted third party, makes it inherently brittle. The goal is for Trent to certify that the message definitely came from Alice and then pass it securely over to Bob. But look at the steps involved. First, Alice encrypts her message, but she uses her secret key that she only shares with Trent. Let's call it KAA.
Okay.
She sends that encrypted blob to Trent. Trent uses KA to decrypt it. That decryption working confirms, okay, this must be from Alice.
Right, because only they share that key.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Then Trent takes that decrypted message, bundles it up with his own certification, maybe his digital signature, and encrypts the whole package again, but this time using his shared key with Bob, KB.
Another shared secret key.
Exactly. Finally, Bob gets this package, decrypts it using KB, and he has the message plus Trent's assurance it came from Alice.
That feels like a lot of steps and a lot of trust placed in Trent. And those keys, where does the trust really come from in that setup?
Well, the trust, paradoxically perhaps, rests entirely on an inference. It's derived from the protocol's complexity. Trent certifies the message came from Alice because he assumes only he and Alice share their secret key, KA.
But what if KA was compromised somehow outside of this specific protocol? Maybe Alice's computer was hacked last week.
Exactly. Or what if Alice or Bob or even Trent deviates just slightly from the prescribed steps? The security of that entire chain rests on the absolutely flawless execution of this 5-step sequence and the absolute continued secrecy of 2 completely distinct shared keys.
So the moment you build a system that relies on inference and these complex, rigid steps, you're basically inviting adversaries to find clever ways around it.
You are. The sources give a fascinating example with a concept called oblivious transfer.
Oblivious transfer.
Okay.
Okay, remind me.
It's a protocol where Alice can choose one of 2 messages that Bob sends, but Bob never finds out which one she actually picked. It has applications in secure computation.
Okay, so how can Alice cheat?
Well, let's say Alice wants to disrupt the process. Maybe she only wants a 50% chance of getting a useful message for some reason. She can introduce noise. She could, for instance, substitute just nonsense bit strings for half of the message component she's supposed to process or receive. This effectively disrupts half the message pairs Bob sent.
Okay, but how does the protocol defend against that kind of disruption?
Well, the security against this kind of cheating relies entirely on a numerical parameter. Let's call it n. This n dictates how many times this oblivious transfer protocol is executed, like how many rounds they do.
So it's just repetition.
It's repetition for statistical security. If we only run the protocol, say, twice, so n2, Alice has a 1 in 2 squared, which is 1 in 4, or a 25% chance of successfully deceiving Bob or disrupting it in the way she wants.
Not great odds for security.
Not at all. Security, therefore, relies entirely on the implementer correctly setting n to be large enough. If we set n10, Alice's chance of deception drops to 1 in 2 to the 10, which is 1 in 10, 24, much better.
So the security isn't guaranteed by the strength of the underlying math of the transfer itself, but by the developers choosing a sufficiently large n within the protocol structure. And if some developer, maybe worried about network lag or something, chooses n5 instead of, say, n100.
The system is instantly and catastrophically weak. Even if the underlying crypto primitives are perfectly secure, it's the protocol failing the math.
That really underscores why protocol design has to be iterative, doesn't it? And reactive. You find flaws, you fix them.
Absolutely. Even protocols that are considered strong when they're launched often have these hidden, latent flaws. Take encrypted key exchange, or EKE. It's a well-known protocol.
Right. And Belivan and Merritt suggested a specific enhancement to part of it, the challenge and response part. What was the flaw they were fixing? And what does that tell us about sort of the life cycle of protocol security?
They were addressing a specific attack vector. Imagine a scenario where a cryptanalyst somehow recovers an old session key, let's call it K.
Okay, a key from a previous communication.
Exactly. If the protocol didn't rigorously ensure key freshness, meaning making sure new keys are truly new and unrelated to old ones, and also ensure separation between sessions, an attacker could potentially use information from that old key, K, to impersonate someone or gain an advantage when initiating a new session. They might even be able to deduce the new key being established.
Wow, okay. So reusing or leaking info from old keys is bad.
Very bad. The enhancement they recommended involved retrofitting the challenge and response mechanism, tweaking the timing, the formatting specifically to prevent an attacker from replaying or leveraging any material related to old keys. It just proves you have to continuously patch. Not the cipher's core math, usually, but the choreography, the steps, the protocol of the key exchange itself.
But that's a really powerful transition, actually. If complexity kills these theoretical protocols, how do we manage to kill even the strongest ciphers in practice? Which we definitely do.
We do, and the answer almost always lies in implementation failures. It's the messy reality of turning that beautiful mathematical theory into actual functional code.
Right. We should probably ground this discussion first in the mathematical bedrock itself, just briefly.
Good idea. So, public key cryptography, the basis for a lot of modern security, relies on concepts like using absolutely massive prime numbers, 512 bits, or often much larger these days. The security of certain schemes, like Rabin's scheme, rests on the difficulty of a specific mathematical problem. Finding square roots modulo a composite number and where is the product of two large primes, p and q.
And finding those square roots is basically as hard as factoring that big number and back into P and Q.
Exactly, it's computationally equivalent. And factoring huge numbers, hundreds of digits long, that takes millennia for any classical computer we have today, or foresee having anytime soon. So theoretically, the system is secure.
And the complexity of that math keeps going up. The recommended key lengths have escalated dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. You look back at, say, 1990, Revis recommendations cited in the sources had the low key length recommendation around 398 bits. Fast forward to 2020, that same low recommendation had jumped significantly to 489 bits.
And the high recommendations are way beyond that now.
Yeah. Soaring past 2,000 bits for certain algorithms like RSA, the math is getting harder to break, no question.
But, and this is the big but,
Yeah.
the reality is most successful attacks don't even try to factor those huge numbers, do they?
No, they don't touch the factoring problem or the discrete log problem usually. They bypass the hard math entirely and exploit the implementation where it's weakest. And the most critical, absolutely perennial failure point we identified in our sources, poor random number generation.
Right. Keys, session variables, initialization vectors, salts, all these critical cryptographic elements need high-quality, unpredictable, truly random bits. But generating that kind of randomness on a computer, it's a deeply counterintuitive challenge.
It really is. A computer is fundamentally a deterministic machine, right? It does exactly what it's told, predictably. To get randomness, you have to look outside the core CPU operations. You have to exploit system entropy.
Entropy, meaning chaos or unpredictability in the system.
Exactly. Measuring things like the precise timing between user keystrokes or mouse movements, I/O inter-arrival timing, or tiny fluctuations in the computer's clock speed, clock skew, even things like electrical noise or air turbulence inside the actual machine casing, if you have the right sensors.
And the sources note that these methods are incredibly sensitive.
Yeah.
Very sensitive to slight changes in the environments.
That's the killer. A tiny change, maybe you swap out a power supply, or you migrate a virtual machine to a different physical server with slightly different hardware characteristics, or even just a shift in the room's ambient temperature, it can subtly alter the patterns of that entropy source. It can make the generated randomness predictable. And if the key generation protocol relies on a predictable seed, well, your mathematically perfect cipher is useless. The attacker can just predict the key before you even start encrypting.
Okay, here's a chilling example from the sources that perfectly illustrates how a key protocol failure just renders a strong algorithm completely null and void. Let's look at a hypothetical modified DES cipher. Now, we know standard DES, especially triple DES, is actually highly resistant to certain attacks like related key attacks. Why? Because of the variability in how its key is rotated and manipulated between the encryption rounds.
Right, the strength of DES comes significantly from its key schedule. That's the protocol, the set of rules, that moves and transforms the 56-bit key through the 16 rounds of encryption. It's complex and designed to diffuse the key's influence. Now imagine we change that key schedule, we change the protocol for key movement. Instead of the complex variable rotations in standard DES, let's say we rotate the key by a consistent, predictable 2 bits after every single round.
Just a simple, fixed 2-bit rotation each time.
Yeah.
Why? Why does that small, consistent rotation completely destroy the cipher's security?
Because it introduces a fixed, predictable relationship between the keys used in different rounds. If the rotation is always the same, an attacker who can employ related key cryptanalysis.
Which involves knowing or influencing how the key changes between different encryptions.
Exactly. They can use that predictability to their advantage. That fixed relationship allows them to correlate information between rounds in a way that was never intended.
It's like building a high-security vault with, say, 16 different combination locks, but the protocol says the combination for the second lock is always just the first lock's combination plus 2, and the third is the second plus 2, and so on.
That's a perfect analogy. The fixed rotation creates this clear dependency chain that shouldn't exist. The researchers found that this modified DES variant can be broken using only 2 to the 17 chosen plaintexts. That's a feasible amount of data. And here's the truly devastating finding. This attack is completely independent of the number of rounds.
Wait, independent? So even if you ran that modified DES for like 1,000 rounds instead of 16, It would still be broken with the same relatively small 2 to the 17 effort.
Yes, exactly. The theoretical strength you think you're adding by increasing the number of rounds, how many iterations you run the core encryption, becomes totally irrelevant. The weakness is entirely in the protocol of key movement, the key scheduling. You've built a cipher designed to resist brute force based on its mathematical operations, but you introduced a design flaw in the internal plumbing, the key handling protocol, that lets the attacker effectively bypass all those rounds. The protocol failure completely supersedes the mathematical complexity.
Wow. And we see this same underlying principle, a weak protocol element, undermining a strong cipher at work in a major historical protocol failure.
Yeah.
WEP, wired equivalent privacy.
WEP. Yes. Use the RC4 stream cipher. RC4 itself was actually considered reasonably strong for its time, especially for lightweight applications. But the WEP implementation, the protocol around RC4, was fatally flawed.
And the main culprit was the initialization vector, the high V, right?
Yes, WEP failed largely because of its ridiculously short, fixed-size 24-bit initialization vector. This IV was supposed to be a non-secret, unique value added to the secret key to produce a unique key stream for every single packet.
But 24 bits, that's only about 16.7 million possibilities. On a busy network, you'd run through all of those IVs really quickly, wouldn't you? Meaning you'd have to reuse them.
Exactly. 4-via collisions were inevitable and frequent, but it was actually worse than just reuse. Researchers discovered that the structure of certain IVs could directly expose bytes of the secret key. They found that if an IV happened to occur in a very specific weak structure, the paper identifies it as being of the form A plus 3 N1X, where A is related to the key byte being targeted and N is usually 256 for RC4.
Okay, that's specific.
It is. But when an IV had this particular structure, it interacted badly with the initial state setup of RC4. Combined with the first byte of the resulting key stream, which could often be inferred because network traffic often starts with predictable headers, it statistically leaked information about 1 byte of the secret WEP key.
So an attacker just had to passively collect enough network traffic, wait for enough packets that happened to use these weak IVs.
Precisely. And by collecting enough of these weak ID packets, they could run a statistical analysis and deduce the secret key bytes one by one.
The key was compromised not by breaking RC4's core mathematics at all.
Not at all. But because the protocol, the WEP standard, mandated this small, often non-random and predictable element, the IV, and that element, when combined with the known internal mechanics of RC4's key stream initialization, created a fatal vulnerability. It's just a stunning example of how a tiny protocol design choice can compromise the entire security of a major, widely deployed system.
Okay, so we've established that technical protocol flaws and weak implementations can absolutely kill security. Now let's widen the lens a bit. Look at more systemic and architectural failures, cases where the system's entire perception of reality is manipulated, often in environments that are supposed to be completely locked down and secure.
Right. And for that, we absolutely have to talk about Stuxnet. It's really the ultimate case study in real-world protocol failure, specifically within a physically secure, air-gapped environment.
Air-gapped meaning disconnected from the internet, right? So all the usual external network attack vectors were supposedly closed off.
Exactly. The system, the Iranian nuclear facility's centrifuge control network, was isolated. All the traditional cryptographic hurdles were thought to be overcome by physical isolation.
But the internal protocols, the way components communicated within that isolated network, were still vulnerable and ultimately manipulated. Stuxnet targeted the Siemens PLCs, the programmable logic controllers.
Those are the industrial computers responsible for managing the physical equipment, in this case, the uranium enrichment centrifuges.
And Stuxnet's core attack wasn't about stealing data, was it? It was about deception.
Pure deception. It had to execute this multi-stage attack protocol. First, it had to get inside the air-gapped network, likely via an infected USB thumb drive carried in by an employee or contractor. That's a protocol break right there, a physical security protocol.
Okay, stage 1, infection.
Stage 2, reconnaissance. Once inside, Stuxnet had to quietly observe the normal operational protocols of the centrifuge controllers. It gathered data on legitimate sensor readings, things like pressure, rotation speed, vibration levels under normal, healthy conditions. It learned what normal looked like.
And then came the third, and really the most insidious phase.
Yeah.
The actual deception protocol.
This is where it gets truly scary. Stuxnet waited for the right moment, then subtly started manipulating the centrifuge speeds, pushing them outside safe operating parameters, causing physical damage. But critically, it simultaneously intercepted the real-time sensor data that would have shown the operators that the centrifuges were starting to fail catastrophically.
So it blocked the alarm signals.
It did more than block them. Instead of transmitting the correct, alarming real-time data back to the human engineers' control room monitors, Stuxnet replayed the pre-recorded information, the data it had captured during that earlier healthy observation phase.
Oh, wow. So the operators.
The operators were actively watching their monitors, and they saw a sea of green calm. Everything looked perfect, pressure nominal, rotation speed exactly as expected, because Stuxnet was feeding them an artificial pre-recorded reality, a digital lie.
While they were watching this lie.
While the engineers were watching this digital facade of normality, the actual physical industrial control systems, the centrifuges, were experiencing these extreme damaging variations in speed. They were literally tearing themselves apart, melting down.
The system failed because its protocol for verifying sensor reality, that fundamental trust relationship between the physical sensor and the digital interface reporting its status, had been completely hijacked by the worm.
Right. The strongest physical security air gapping was made totally irrelevant by manipulating the internal communication protocol, the protocol of trust between sensor and screen.
We see a similar kind of systemic breakdown, though maybe less physically dramatic, in the NotPetya attack that hit Maersk, the global shipping giant.
Yes, Maersk. Another huge case. And here, the failure wasn't really about encryption strength either. It was about system architecture and the protocols designed for resilience.
Maersk's architectural protocol for resilience, as I understand it, relied heavily on decentralization. They had something like 150 domain controllers spread all around the world.
That's right. And these domain controllers were designed to constantly sync their data with one another. The idea, which sounds pretty sound on the surface, was that if one site, say Copenhagen, went down, the others in New Jersey or Singapore acting as decentralized backups could just pick up the workload. Business continues.
A distributed redundancy plan. Makes sense. But the flaw was in the assumption underlying that protocol, wasn't it? They assumed failures would be localized, or at least happen at different times. Asynchronous failure.
Exactly. They hadn't planned for synchronous failure. The whole system got wiped out when the NotPetya malware, exploiting a known vulnerability it carried, managed to simultaneously reach and compromise every single one of those domain controllers globally within minutes.
And because the architectural protocol mandated that these controllers constantly sync their data.
And they were all infected and being wiped at essentially the same time.
Yeah.
That distributed architecture, designed for resilience, turned into a coordinated global self-destruction mechanism. The good data was instantly overwritten by the bad encrypted state everywhere.
There was no single clean offline backup that hadn't been touched by this rapid synchronization protocol. Their decentralized system, designed to protect against a local fire or flood, became their total annihilation strategy when faced with a fast-spreading synchronous cyber attack.
It's a stark lesson in understanding the assumptions baked into your resilience protocols.
These technical examples are pretty astounding, but often the most effective systemic protocol break is, well, the simplest one to exploit, the human element, social engineering.
Always. Security is ultimately about keeping secrets, right? And as our sources point out, the simple requirement to keep secrets secret is far more difficult to meet than the average user may suspect, especially when humans are the gatekeepers.
Attackers just rely on exploiting flaws in our operational security protocols, our human procedures.
Absolutely. Consider the classic anecdote, probably apocryphal but illustrative, maybe from Kevin Mitnick's playbook or similar stories. An attacker calls a tech support person and just directly asks for their password.
You'd think that wouldn't work.
Well, the victim is initially suspicious, right? They think, why would IT, of all people, need to ask for my password? They should know better.
But the attacker anticipates that suspicion.
Exactly. The attacker quickly counters, saying something like, oh no, I don't need your password for me. I just need to cross-reference the account data on this form you supposedly filled out earlier. Can you just confirm the password you wrote down here so I can verify it's the right form?
It reframes the request.
Yeah.
Makes it sound procedural, less threatening.
Right. It's a fast manipulation. It exploits the employee's internal trust protocol, assuming the caller is legitimate IT and maybe their sense of duty or wanting to be helpful. It creates this little bubble of pressure and confusion where their adherence to formal security policy gets overridden.
It's a subtle dance, isn't it? The attacker avoids an outright, easily detectable lie and instead creates this plausible scenario.
Yeah, a high-pressure situation where the employee's confusion, maybe their desire not to seem obstructive, and their trust in the caller's perceived authority just overrides the formal security training they might have had.
And there's another brilliant manipulation mentioned, which kind of reverses the typical request entirely.
Oh, the incompetent attacker routine.
Yeah. Instead of asking for a secret directly, the attacker pretends to be completely clueless and asks, say, a database administrator to walk him through the steps of carrying out some computer process, maybe restoring a backup or querying something that the attacker claims not to know how to do.
Right. This plays on the human inclination to be helpful, to teach, and it assumes the victim won't suspect malicious intent from someone appearing so incompetent. The administrator, focused on just explaining the steps clearly, inadvertently reveals all sorts of sensitive operational details, specific commands, crucial file paths, internal server names, maybe even error messages that give clues. All the little pieces an attacker needs to actually perform that process themselves later, unsupervised.
So the overarching systemic failure here really comes down to policy weakness, or maybe policy enforcement weakness.
Or lack of training. Attackers target employees who are unlikely to realize the danger, or maybe who simply lack training with respect to company disclosure policy and procedures.
The operational security protocol. Who is allowed to access what information, under what specific circumstances, and crucially, who is authorized to ask for what that seems to be the easiest link in the security chain to break. Much, much easier than factoring a 2048-bit prime number.
Infinitely easier. And we see this even with the most basic failure. People using weak passphrases, or worse, the human tendency to reuse the same or a similar password in more than one system. Attackers absolutely rely on that credential reuse. One breach gives them keys to many kingdoms.
Okay, so we've established this pattern. Complex protocols are fragile, implementations are often weak, and humans are easily manipulated. This brings us squarely to the fundamental security paradox we started with. We rely on systems and secrets that are, in their entirety, simply unknowable or uncontrollable.
Yeah, the difficulty of truly hiding secrets just cannot be overstated. We operate under this implicit, often flawed assumption that if a secret like an encryption key or an API credential is embedded deep within a binary, compiled code,
It's probably safe, obscured.
we assume it's likely to stay secret. But this is fundamentally wrong in the face of a determined attacker.
Because attackers are just incredibly proficient at reverse engineering these days.
They are. They use sophisticated tools, disassemblers, decompilers, debuggers to pull apart code, inspect memory dumps while the program is running, analyze execution flow. They can find hard-coded passwords. They can often figure out proprietary encryption algorithms if they're homebrewed. And they can locate where key material is stored, whether it's on disk or temporarily in memory.
So if the security absolutely depends on keeping that key secret, the physical and software implementation has to be flawless. And keeping the code itself secret, that's basically impossible against a persistent adversary.
Right. The level of diligence required to truly protect embedded secrets is far more difficult to meet than the average user or even many developers may suspect.
And compounding this problem is just the sheer depth and complexity of the modern technology stack we build on. No system is truly standalone anymore, is it?
Not at all. It's this dense Frankenstein monster, really, built on layers upon layers of abstraction. We rely on open source libraries for core functions, commercial cryptographic libraries we didn't write, operating systems maintained by third parties like Microsoft or the Linux community, application frameworks built by different vendors entirely.
It's turtles all the way down.
Pretty much. And no single entity, not even the organization deploying the final system, can realistically truly audit that entire stack from top to bottom. You're forced to rely on certifications, vendor assurances, reputation, basically trust, because full understanding is simply unattainable.
And that complexity breeds obscurity. And obscurity is definitely not security.
It's often the opposite.
So how does this immense complexity influence the perspective of cybersecurity leadership, like the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer? When they adopt these big industry security frameworks, NIST standards, ISO 27001, how do they approach managing this, frankly, uncontrollable situation?
Well, the sources suggest they often approach it, perhaps necessarily, like painting by numbers. These frameworks are absolutely crucial, don't get me wrong. They define what secure is by specifying a whole catalog of controls, mandatory checklists of policies, procedures, technical requirements. This is essential for governance, for compliance, for having some structured approach.
So the frameworks provide the blueprint for security.
Yeah.
They tell you what you're supposed to build.
Exactly. They define the what. But the implementation, the That's where it often falls apart. The effective strategy requires, as the sources say, diligence and rigorous application of those controls across the board consistently. But in the real world, under pressure from project deadlines, budget cuts, competing business priorities, that rigorous application is often the first thing that gets compromised.
Right. A CISO might mandate using the latest, greatest encryption standard from the framework.
But if the development team down the line misconfigures the random number generator because they were rushed, or they reuse keys inappropriately because it was easier, then the framework becomes this beautifully written, comprehensive, but ultimately useless document in practice. The framework defined the ideal protocol, but real life, real pressures compromise the implementation.
And finally, just to add another layer of complexity, we have to briefly acknowledge the ultimate theoretical challenge looming on the horizon, the threat of quantum computing.
Ah, yes. The elephant in the room for long-term cryptography.
This represents a massive, potentially protocol-breaking threat that hasn't even fully materialized yet in practical terms, but for which security professionals are already having to plan.
It really is the ultimate, potentially inescapable protocol obsolescence scenario, the underlying principle of quantum computing, things like superposition.
Where a quantum bit, a qubit, can be both 0 and 1 at the same time.
Right. And entanglement. These capabilities fundamentally change the nature of computation, changing what kinds of problems are hard and what kinds are easy for a computer to solve.
And specifically, it breaks the core mathematical complexity that most of our current public key crypto relies on today.
Absolutely. Shor's algorithm, a quantum algorithm, implies that current public key schemes, specifically those based on the difficulty of factoring large numbers, like RSA, or computing discrete logarithms, like Diffie-Hellman or elliptic curve crypto, will become theoretically solvable in polynomial time, meaning efficiently solvable.
Once someone builds a sufficiently large, stable quantum computer.
Correct. Once that happens, the very mathematical basis of our modern cryptographic protocol stack for key exchange and digital signatures effectively becomes irrelevant, obsolete. We are currently in a race to design, standardize, and eventually deploy new, complex, and largely untested post-quantum cryptographic protocols.
Which will, of course, inevitably introduce their own entirely new set of implementation challenges, protocol flaws, and deployment headaches.
Without a doubt. It's the security paradox amplified, really. Even as the underlying mathematics theoretically improves or adapts to new threats, the systems and protocols we build around them seem destined to become increasingly fragile and unstable in new ways.
Okay, so if we step back from this whole deep dive,
Yeah.
the key takeaway seems crystalline, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The security of any system, whether it's handling global commerce or state secrets, is really only as strong as its weakest protocol.
Absolutely.
And that weak link, it could be something technical, like the choice of a rotational schedule for a key inside an algorithm, or the quality of random number generation pulled from system entropy.
Or it could be an architectural decision, like assuming failures will never be synchronous.
Or, just as often, it's simply a human answering a phone call and being tricked into sharing information they shouldn't have. The human protocol fails.
I think the true danger that emerges from our sources isn't just the existence of these complex mathematical problems that are hard to solve. That's a given. The real danger is the prevalence of systemic and protocol failures that render all that mathematical complexity completely irrelevant. We are, in effect, living in an era where we've almost normalized the plague of constant low-level cyber attacks. We seem to be enduring this ongoing vulnerability crisis where the basic foundations, the implementations, the protocols, the human factors are perpetually unstable, even while the encryption algorithms themselves on paper get exponentially stronger.
It's that gap, isn't it? The gap between the pristine theoretical model in the lab and the messy, complex, interconnected, human-operated network in the real world. That's the real battlefield.
And maybe the most provocative thought is that we've become accustomed to it. We've normalized this crisis, accepting this state of perpetual low-level vulnerability as just the cost of doing business online, even as the underlying threats continue to mutate into potentially deadlier, faster, more synchronous versions that could hit us much harder than we anticipate.
That is a critical, maybe slightly sobering thought to end on. But it sets the stage perfectly for our next discussion. We've spent this time talking extensively about the failures, the ways things break. Next time, we're going to dive into the flip side. The technical standards, the applied methodologies, the frameworks that are specifically designed to try and fix these exact protocol problems.
Right. How do we try to restore some sanity to the chaos of implementation? We'll explore how things like diligence, rigorous standardization, better testing, and formal methods attempt to bridge that gap between perfect math and imperfect reality.
So join us next time as we explore the attempts to build stronger protocols on the deep dive.